and let's see what happens. Here you go.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Matthew. So I'm Sue Shinomiya. I think there may be one or two people out there who don't know much about me, but I'm calling in today from Portland, Oregon, so it's 8 o'clock in the morning for me. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and hopefully not good night until the end of this. I am a global business passport is the name of my company, and my goal is to empower professionals to connect, lead, and thrive across cultures and differences. And people know me, as Matthew pointed out, as a leading expert on Japan, which is, of course, my other country, and I always have a foot in that culture at all times. But I'm also interested in the rest of the world and live and virtual, and I'm really interested in how we get things done and lead effectively and respectfully and inclusively across diverse and complex issues that we have at work. I'm also an adjunct faculty at Portland State University's Master of International Management program, and I have enthusiastically served on the board of directors of SIETAR-USA, and it was a thrill to have been in Dublin at SIETAR-USA. So let me jump into this, and some of you were attending the TED-style talk that I gave in Dublin, and a few of you may have been in the not quite so TED-style talk that I gave in Tulsa at the SIETAR-USA Congress just after the US election last year. So let me begin with my story, and I'm going to switch this, so if your screen goes black, that is by design. I was kicked out of my house by my Japanese husband, and if you know anything about Japanese culture, this would be considered a most severe form of punishment. A parent would kick his child out of the house to exclude them from the inner group. In Japanese, the word is uchi, and have them be dashed out into the outer world, or soto. So you know that this was a serious situation. Now let me back up to the beginning. So in 1996, I had been living in Japan, and my husband and I had moved from Tsukuba, Japan, to Portland, Oregon, thus ending my 6 years as the manager of an on-site intercultural program at Intel Japan with Clark Consulting Group. I had done this fantastic job of sending myself off, hiring my replacement, attending endless going away parties, and I caused no pain for either company on the US side or on the Japan side as I was leaving. But I forgot one blatantly obvious thing, which wasn't obvious to me at the time. I didn't reconnect with my former US culture, and I didn't set up my new life there. Re-entry hit me very hard. My high-paying 60-hour-a-week, highly responsible leadership job was gone, and my connections that I'd had in Japan didn't matter a damn. I had no friends in Portland, and you know, I couldn't relate to the local people that I met. And there was that question, where are you from? It had suddenly become very complex. If I tell people I'm from California, that was a problem in Oregon because they had kind of a mindset about Californians. And if I told people I was from Japan, that would confuse them because, well, I don't look Japanese. And I couldn't get a job to save my life. No one really cared about my rich experience overseas, and they wanted to know if I had a manufacturing or engineering background. My identity was pretty much thrown into oblivion, and I had lost my footing. As an interculturalist also, I felt that I had failed at reentry. I should know better. And I'll tell you something, you see this picture on the right, that's Mount Hood, that's in the Oregon, or in the Portland area. All of this beauty that is Portland really does nothing for you if you are a mess and you can't see it. And in 1997 and 96, there were record floods. I was drowning. My world felt like it was shrinking and the walls were kind of closing in on me. And at that time, there was no social media, no such thing. No LinkedIn, no Facebook. I didn't know where to turn, and I didn't know who I was, and my sense of self had kind of melted. My husband really couldn't do anything else but push me out of the house, tell me to pull myself together, get myself out of this just disjointed state and get out there, find something. I was deeply disconnected. And it hurts to be disconnected because when we are socially disconnected, particularly, it does register in our brains in the same way as physical pain. Now, many of you who are on this webinar, I know you, and I know you also have a story of being disconnected and feeling that way. When have you felt that way, that disconnect, that being an outsider, being marginalized? Maybe it was a situation like mine. Maybe it was a client from hell. Maybe it was a close family member. So take yourself back to that terrible moment just for a moment right now, and imagine if you could download your story to a trusted, embracing, wise, and non-judging friend, and that they could understand it without you even speaking. You just kind of mind transfer. Feel it in your body. Where in your body do you feel it? Kind of revisit that. If we were sitting together in a room, I would have you look at each other and do an eye contact exercise about this. But since we're not, we have to imagine in the virtual space that we're telling our stories through our minds. If you feel so compelled, give your story a name. You can type it in chat if you want to. We won't disclose it, but I decided to give my story a name. Doomed in suburban Portland, kind of an ironic one. Kind of allows me to let it go and give it some honor, because I learned a lot from this story. Being socially disconnected, as I said, it registers in our brain as pain. And yet, our stories about our disconnection can be the thing that connects us with other human beings. This is very important. So I know that you have a story of disconnect, and if you want to, again, as I said, give your story a name, type it in chat. We won't share it unless you want us to. I crave connectedness, the state of being joined or linked, the feeling of belonging or having affinity. But unfortunately, this is how I feel a lot of the time. Do you feel this way a lot of the time? I'm in pieces. It's, where am I? How do I feel that reconnectedness again? And the ironic thing is that many of us might be out there in the world feeling the same way. That we are all at the same time simultaneously feeling like we cannot connect. Connectedness might be especially elusive to those of us who have multiple cultures that we connect to, and we have more than one identity. I'd like you to imagine what connectedness feels like. I can imagine what it feels like. It's a beautiful, wonderful, nurturing feeling of being embraced, and that feeling of belonging to something. I'm adding these wonderful wise words from Brene Brown, the woman who did the TED Talk on the power of vulnerability. It is the most watched TED Talk of all time, I believe. Connection. It is why we're here. It gives us meaning and purpose in our lives. And neurobiologically, that's how we're wired. It's why we're here. It is part of our evolutionary prerogative. I'll be explaining this in a moment, but I'm here to talk about how we are deeply disconnected, even though we have the option to be continuously connected. And you know what? These are such crazy times. The world looks like an increasingly disconnected place, and that is bad. Fast forward to today, my husband and I are still married after 25 years, so you can breathe easy on that part. Things, he'd let me back in the house. But through that experience, I really did learn about myself and what Brene Brown has said here, that connectedness is very important to me. And I started to understand that disconnect was a very, very uncomfortable state for me. So to talk about being deeply disconnected, I'm facing a fear of my own. And especially today, in these times. I tell my clients that we now have, of course, the technology to connect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that we have collaboration platforms that abound. We have Skype, we have FaceTime, and near reality virtual teleconferencing and video conferencing. And I think some of us are going to holograms, but I'm not quite ready for that. But most people are relatively new to the notion that we need to develop our human-to-human mindset, our human-to-human skill set. So we don't really connect with other human beings when we're using the technology that we're supposed to use to connect with each other, which means we are probably not getting the most out of our tools. We lack the self-awareness, the emotional intelligence in the place that it's most needed. So in researching this topic, I learned so much about what it means to me to be connected, and that there are some new interesting revelations in neurosciences that can inform us about this human drive. And I personally have taken a stand for connectedness. And here is my metaphor. I hope that a few of you, in addition to myself, were able to experience the total solar eclipse on Monday. I was fortunate enough, privileged enough to be in a place of 100% totality. And I shared that experience, that intimate experience, with as many as 20 million other people, especially in the United States. It was a fantastic, intimate moment, rich in symbolism. And Matthew, I may need to do a whole other webinar on this topic because it's such an apt metaphor. But
Yes.
I'd like you to think about it for just, it's possible, but think about it for a moment. I mean, that sun, this is kind of the science of it. That sun that's always there for us, kind of like the light and the joy that is naturally abundant in our lives. We take it for granted until that moment that it's gone and becomes this little black hole in the sky. But it's like that story that we had of negativity and darkness and disconnect a moment ago. Think about the science of it. The sun is 400 times bigger than that moon. And yet we let that story of darkness, we let that moon come in front of us and be in exactly the right position to block out all that light, to block out all that natural joy that we are supposed to have in our life, that the abundance of it. It's interesting how we can suck all the heat out of the air. So think about what story might be blocking your sunlight today, your joy, might be disconnecting you from what's natural and abundant in your life. In the old days, of course, people thought that the light might never come back. But now we know through science and through reality that it does come back. And so we can enjoy it. We can enjoy the beauty of it. That light always comes back. So consider that moment of returning to the light. That's our resilience. But if we're not anticipating the return of the light, that's the time that we go blind because we are not putting our sunglasses back on or our solar glasses back on and preparing for coming out of the darkness. This is our resilience. What if we could honor those dark moments and our dark stories and regard them in the same precious way that we were so captivated by seeing that solar eclipse? Those dark stories are the ones that inform us. Those dark stories, those disconnected stories, are the ones that make us who we are. We know what's important to us, which could be the opposite of that. So there's my metaphor about the total solar eclipse. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me move on to the background for this webinar, which is looking at our public and our private selves. I had, again, on Monday, a really big experience with thinking I was going to have this kind of private, intimate experience, and I ended up sharing it with 20 million other people, and at least 1 million of them were on the road going back at the same time I was. So back to my background and connectedness. Let me give you the definition. And when I say connectedness, this is what I mean. It's the state of being joined or linked, that feeling of belonging, having affinity, or a sense of being whole. And some of these pictures are from my hikes around Portland and the situations in which I feel whole. Going way back into my history of working in the intercultural field, very early on, I was fortunate enough to take a course from Dr. Dean Barnlin of San Francisco State University. And he's the one who gave us these concentric circles to describe our public and private selves. So imagine culture A, culture B, and in culture A, there's a very permeable line between myself and what I talk about with other people. And in culture B, it's a rather thick line. And what is considered public information in culture A, there's a wide swath there. But in culture B, it's a much thinner swath of what is considered public information in terms of what we would disclose in the public realm. So notice the contrast here. This image really impressed me because this had been my experience too, that in the US, for example, people talk about themselves more freely and relate and talk to and engage with people that they don't know, total strangers, whereas in a country like Japan, there's a lot less of that. It's not a common thing to do. So here's how it works out when the two cultures come together. Oh my, is this another eclipse analogy? Believe me, this one was not intentional. If you were in Tulsa, this was up there as far back as that. But the notion being that culture A comes and kind of invades the space of culture B, and the two of them may not connect in this way. But what was also interesting, kind of a side result of the research, was an understanding of where people define the self. And in a culture like culture A, the sense of self was quite defined, and my independence and who I am as an individual was quite clear. Whereas in culture B, it was very hard for people to describe themselves as being distinct or different or separated from anybody else. So a very different sense of self. And of course, these two models, these two analogies might start to look familiar into our fruits and veggie models. And some of you may have heard of the peach analogy, which is more like the culture A or the US culture, where it's very easy to get to know somebody, it's easy to talk about yourself, but when it comes to really connecting as a long-term friend, that pit is very, very hard. And it may not be easy to get through to a real opinion or to something deeper, a question about religion or something that's kind of hidden within the person. And then there's culture B, which is the coconut culture, and the hard shell that's on the outside. It's very hard to break in. There has to be a shared context or some reason for them to communicate, but our coconut cultures. And I realized that neither one of these analogies worked very well for Japan for me. So I came up with the onion culture, which means that you go from the outside to the inside in deliberate layers, and it takes time, and it takes getting to know somebody, and it takes getting from that one situation to a new context. So these are very interesting models that we sometimes use in our cultural work, and they're very helpful for people to quickly grasp something about a new culture that they're not familiar with. But I have found that in the world of social media, these seem to be broken. It's interesting that people will share things on social media that they won't in a in person even. We need to get some fresh and new ideas and maybe some new models. I'm not really quite sure I have a new model yet, but I did find this interesting picture where we've got an iPhone in a coconut. Anyway, it's a question that we need to ask ourselves about. Is there a third way that we have our identities and that we share our public and private information, our public and private selves? Maybe we need an online persona versus a in-person persona. And the things that happen nowadays, since we're so connected and hooked in and we have our phones and they become an extension of our hands. So here is me trying to connect with nature and having my family with me, and we're all looking at a beautiful scene to see if we can all, share an experience. And here are my son and my husband who are enjoying their experience of waterfalls on their screens. And as much as I try to argue with them, put those phones away and all this, of course, I'm taking a picture with my phone, and we are all, in a sense, enhancing the experience through social media in some way and through our pictures. It's fascinating. What do we do and where are we going with this? Facebook is an interesting example of social media. And here's Mark Zuckerberg talking about his company's mission. I'm fascinated with his company's mission, which is to give people the power to share and make the world more connected and open. And whether you like or dislike Mark Zuckerberg, it's interesting. I liked him on Facebook, or I'm linked in somehow with him on Facebook, and I hear his comments and I hear his thoughts. And I'm sure he won't mind me sharing this picture and his examples. I think I became a more convinced that Facebook was on the right track when I found out that their director of leadership development is Kate Berardo, who is someone who many of us might know in the intercultural communications field. And the fact that she is there and developing leaders of the future in an interconnected and interculturally sensitive way kind of gives me faith in it. But the technology also has its dark side. Of course, it has made us more aware of deeper divides, and it has exposed and, I guess in a sense, emboldened those who might have very dark tendencies and dark motivations. The hate and disconnect that we might see that's somehow freely shared in this space. It's quite fascinating, and some of us may be tempted to just unplug and get off social media and kind of cut ourselves off from it in a sense. I'm not convinced for me personally that that's the best solution, because if we are people who are intentional about bridging across differences, about engaging with people, it may be that we can use the social media for the purposes of good. And I want to move into about some information about the neurosciences to it. That Facebook, this is this wonderful picture that kind of looks like a neuropath of the world. These are all of the different Facebook connections around the world. There is a part of our brain that activates when we meet people. In this book that I have been reading called Social, Matthew Lieberman talks about why our brains are wired to connect. So when we meet a person and we think that the person that we meet is a really good fit for us, there's a part of our brain called the RPC that lights up, and that allows us to connect pretty easily with that person. And then there's this other part of our brain, and I don't know if I can pronounce this word correctly, the temporoparietal junction, I'll just call it the TPJ, that gets activated when we share deeply with others, possibly with strangers, but maybe not. When we share our deep, dark secrets and what's on our mind, our fears, our dreams, and our aspiration, the brain actually lights up like a Christmas tree. It explains our desire for deep connectedness. This is why people can get addicted to social media, actually. People who are, some people who really like to post and enjoy that texting moment. Maybe they enjoy tweeting a bit too much. At that moment, we are sharing in a very transparent way and without judgment, without filtering, maybe a little bit like you shared your story without having to explain it earlier on today. But the behavior activates a high level of oxytocin in our brain. It's this wonderful chemical, which is that neurotransmitter that enables us to bond and connect with others deeply. So social media isn't all bad, and sometimes it can actually lead us to a shared context and a different kind of connectedness. I had an experience of this pretty recently as I was walking down the aisle of my local supermarket. There I was in the coffee and tea aisle, and I see this face of a lovely woman who seemed to be very absorbed in something, and I couldn't tell, was she making a decision? What was she doing? And I caught her eye. It happened to be my neighbor, Claudia, who is originally from Mexico. And though we had not spoken in months, without exchanging a single word, without any kind of additional interaction, we moved to each other and we embraced warmly. We held that moment. We were both holding back tears right there in aisle 3. How is such an instantaneous, deep connection even possible? Well, I had been following her on Facebook, so I knew that her dear mother, whom I had met a few years before, who attended Zoom classes with us, and she had been to my son's birthday party. My dear friend Claudia was very close to her, and she had recently died of cancer just a few weeks earlier. And Claudia had just come back from Mexico and the funeral and the family events there. It was strange in a way to have a very connected moment like this with this sweet person, but I was so thankful in that moment that I had Facebook and I could share that context and not have to talk about it and go through a story. It was a beautiful moment for me. So back to our brains. Here's a good brain picture. As I tell that story, the one about my friend Claudia and other stories, if I were to hook up a EKG or something that would measure your brain waves and my brain waves, stories are so powerful because when you tell a story, the brain waves of your audience actually sync up and they start to align, and they are in sync with my brain waves as the storyteller, actually. And this is why stories are so powerful and an excellent way to connect, because literally we're connecting on a brainwave level. But wait, there is more about brains. I've been reading Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's book called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. I totally recommend it. She was a neuroscientist who went in search of where in the brain is the fingerprint or footprint of our emotions, any single emotion. And what she did in the end was, through her research, she realized she had to turn this whole, she calls it brain blob idea about, in this part of your brain is this, and that part of your brain is what. She turned it on its head, because what she found out is, through her research, that emotions are not actually universal, but they vary from culture to culture. She went back and redid those experiences of showing faces to untouched tribes, for example. And what emerged was that your emotions are a result of a combination of many things. They emerge as a combination of the physical properties of your body, and in that moment, what's going on with you physically, a flexible brain that wires itself to whatever environment it has developed in, and into your culture and your upbringing. It was so gratifying to see that a neuroscientist had discovered that culture actually has a place in the neuroscience arena. And what she says is that emotions are not triggered, you actually create them. And this is her theory of constructed emotion. In every waking moment, your brain uses past experiences organized as concepts to guide your actions and give you sensations, give you meaning. When those concepts involved our emotion concepts, your brain constructs instances of emotion. The implications are enormous. We create our emotions. Many of us in this virtual room today are quite self-aware, and we know this. It's very hard to control our emotions, perhaps, but we are actually changing our lives and changing this world based on our response to the stimulus around us. It's a wonderful superpower to be able to tap into this. And this kind of brings me to my next part here about our stories of connection and how we can create a world that is what we want to see in the world. But I'd like to pause here. Sorry, I didn't give you much of a warning here, but if there's any of you who might have a question about something I've addressed so far, this is a good chance for you to type any questions you might have in chat. And if you're wondering about this mysterious picture, this is a moment of connectedness for me. I'm actually standing inside of a tree and being embraced by the tree. Beautiful. I can't quite explain the experience, but if you come and visit me in Portland, maybe I can take you up to the Columbia Gorge and we can find this together. So, Matthew, do we have any questions that have come in so far?
Yes, well, there's going back a bit. It might be seem a little bit out of context. There's a couple of things, just a thought I had as well. So we had one. I was lucky enough. So that returning part you had to Oregon, I was lucky enough to comment from somebody. I was lucky enough to join an expat community in my home country when I returned. So I managed to limit the impact of disconnection. I immediately felt connected to the expat community, so my suffering was very mild. That's one comment, which I think is quite interesting. A joke from the Republic of Ireland. Are there a lot of tears when moving through the onion culture?
Thank you, Joe.
I mean, just you triggered something in my mind, this idea of we are not one person, we have multiple identities depending on community and age and state and all sorts of things. And then that relationship. So I was in a training yesterday, and I was being my role, someone else was being their role, teacher and learner. So we have a co-constructed relationship. So just taking that further, when I'm tweeting or blogging, or the guys out here are listening to this broadcast, so we have a role. So just a quick, light reflection. Who do we have a role with? Is it with the technology? Is it with the broad community? Is it that this technology allows you almost uniquely to have one relationship with multiple people in multiple time zones in multiple countries? Is there something going on, just almost ethereal, ridiculous level? I mean, what are we doing here? We've got a global webinar with people all over the world, and we're doing one thing. I mean, it was impossible before this technology. So this idea of what is it, this co-constructed relationship? I'm waffling. Over to you, Sue.
That is lovely. And on the two parts of that is rejoining with an expat community. Those of you who know Kate Brubaker and her Small Planet community, she is somebody who's trying to use the technology that you have just said about having a co-constructed community among people who are in a reentry process and also people who coach people through the reentry process. So definitely there are more tools and a lot more resources available to us. I want to come back to this because this community that's on the call right now, I mean, we are the ones who are creating this new, potentially much more connected world. So keep that in mind. And this is what the neuroscience informs us of in books like Social, which I'll get to in a moment, that we have a kind of human superpower if we know what our brains can do. If we have, we continue to research that and become much more aware of what we can do. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how I connect with myself and how I connect with my community. But very important point. Thank you for that, Matthew. So moving into some of my interesting connectedness and how I get there. We have to sometimes go up or down the stairs to get to where we want to go. This is a picture on the coast of Oregon. How do we get there? And I want to walk you through a little bit about my own experiences. And how I have connected in different contexts, and hopefully it will inspire you as well. I think we can create meaning and connection through people. In January of this year, I decided to take a trip to a very exotic and new country for me, Myanmar. Some of you know this, and maybe you've heard of Burma, and probably most of us, unless you've been there, we have to get out our Google Maps to figure out where Myanmar is. But I craved connectedness with this magical culture. And I really didn't want to just see it through the eyes of a traveler and a tourist. I wanted to find a really meaningful way, a way to create meaning for this culture. And I dance, and dance is important to me. So I set out to learn traditional Burmese dance. I managed to arrange this through the hotel. There was the travel agent or go-to person at the hotel I was staying at, and she set this up for me. You know, she was quite reluctant to, but she said, bring your $50, 50 US dollars on a crisp bill, whatever that was about. But as instructed, I donned my new tailor-made blouse and longi. You can see this kind of floor-length skirt, or it's a wraparound skirt. It is worn by everybody, by the way, in Myanmar. Little cultural tip: men and women alike. Men rarely wear pants in that country. They wear these longis. They're beautiful and very comfortable in a hot environment. So I got in the taxi and I drove through what felt like an Indiana Jones style movie of going right through the marketplace and ending up in some residential area with a home. There were no signs. There was no studio that I could see from the outside. And a diva-like lady ushered me into her home, and she was the instructor. The front room of this little house was the dance studio and the music studio and a lot of different things. And the two cats also had the run of the place. It was quite an interesting experience for me. The dance lesson commenced, and I found myself in my Facebook Live debut. So here was a crisis of public and private self for me. It's like, who gave you permission to video me and send me out to the whole world live? Oh my gosh, who might be watching this? It was very interesting, but I decided I would be my best interculturally sensitive self and just go with it, live in the ambiguity, see what happens next, and I'm so glad I did. She taught me a traditional Burmese New Year's dance, and it was just lovely. It reminded me a little bit of traditional Polynesian or Hawaiian dances I had learned in my youth. It was interesting to feel that deep connection. And you speak with your hands in this dance, and the movement's very fluid, and the hips stay in place. It was just a very comfortable, wonderful feeling. I asked permission to stay through the next few sessions, the next few lessons, and that was wonderful. I could talk to the young women who she was also teaching. And before my departure, all of the students that were there, all of her pupils got up, and we did this Burmese New Year's dance together as my big finale. It was a great moment for the ages, and forever emblazoned on Facebook if you want to find it. Later, I found out that this friend of mine, the woman there on the left, was actually a very well-known dancer, singer, and TV personality. So she really was a diva, and I was literally dancing with the star. And now that we are friends on Facebook, I have this interesting window to her world. It's very different. She does shows in hotels, on cruise ships, sometimes on TV. Sometimes she gets fan postings of clips from her old days when she was on TV more regularly. Maybe she's watching us now, because it's interesting. She follows the things that I do and is fascinated by them, and I'm fascinated with her world, and we respond to each other in a way that, you know, even locally I don't respond to people necessarily. I feel this strange connection to her and to her country, and a whole new narrative of connectedness about this new country. So I invite you to find those moments and those ways of connecting and creating meaning through people. So this is my one idea about connecting. And of course, many of us enjoy travel and learning about new places. But also, the important place to connect with is with ourselves. And that's sort of where it starts. Meditation, breathing. If you take just a moment, and maybe this picture will inspire you to just breathe very deeply into the bottom of your diaphragm and let the air go out. Being in nature and prayer, and maybe it's an intense exercise, hiking in nature, anything that disconnects us from the distractions of the rest of the world and allows us to reconnect with the self, with the soul, with the universe, God, envisioning a world that feels connected. Let's have that for a moment. So practicing mindfulness and stillness. Tapping into beauty, nature, creativity is another of my 5 paths to connectedness. And this is a picture of the Japanese garden here in Portland, and it's a creative work of my photography, and beautiful. The colors are beautiful, and enjoying this. Also the creative side of me, the dance, writing, maybe it's food and art. All of us have a creative outlet. And the other part is, of course, staying curious, being curious. This is a picture of Yangon in Myanmar. But developing our curiosity through our travel, language, reading, study. Of course, the most important part of this is the social and the interactive part of it. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to talk just a little bit about our work of interaction. This is, of course, a very connected moment for me. This is the first time that my little baby son, who's now 16, is touching the ocean with his toes. We need to interact with the intention of connectedness. I had a wonderful experience post-Dublin Congress of traveling with a group of about 10 of us interculturalists throughout the wild, wild west of Ireland. And it was just fantastic because we probably could have gone down an alleyway and had a wonderful cultural experience. But the fact of having people who are all in that moment and feeling connected and appreciating all of the cultural aspects of it, it was fantastic. It seems like there is a universe that is telling us about connecting and interacting. Earlier this year in April, Pope Francis gave a wonderful TED Talk in Italian, I believe, about how we live our life through our interactions. Life flows through our relationships with others. Life is not merely time passing by. Life is about our interactions. And I think that's very, very important. So I'm going to live in that, breathe in that. If you have an opportunity, be sure to catch his TED Talk as well. So about our work, and this is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of how we show up and what we take a stand for. This is the Intercultural Training Channel, so I'm assuming that many of us are doing the work in the intercultural world, or presentations, diversity and inclusiveness work, and we are quite passionate about what we do, and we take a stand on issues that are important to us. And if there's one thing I've learned in life, is the minute I take a strong stand and commit to it and start communicating it, the opposite just comes right up and hits me smack in the face. For example, maybe you took a stand for social justice and you're surrounded by injustices. You take a stand for inclusiveness and it seems like everybody is being exclusive and prejudiced. The minute I took a stand for connectedness, I think Brexit happened. The minute I took a stand for connectedness, the US election last November, the results came out for that. It seemed like the whole world was responding to my stand for connectedness and breaking apart in some interesting ways. That we are, in the US, for example, it does seem we are marching into deep polarization, the state of us and them, very disconnected. It actually made me think about the DMIS, the Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity. Those of you who know this model, you know that on the one end, you have the monocultural denial that cultures are even there, and a lack of awareness of anything in the rest of the world and the different cultures and differences among people. And on the other end of that same continuum is integration and full adaptation and interest and curiosity and really living in other cultures, integration into the culture. If you know this model, you'll know what stage I'm thinking of when I think of this polarization. It's somewhere, on the denial side or the monocultural side of us and them, and seeing them as being different and maybe not as good as me. And I'd like us to really think about, am I guilty of that too? Am I making it worse? Am I making it more disconnected by this otherism? Probably like me, there have been a few moments when you have turned on your TV and yelled at it, or maybe given it the finger. Those people are so stupid. How can they be so uneducated? They will never understand my experience. And one of my current favorites is actually among people who are, quote unquote, on the same side, telling me that this isn't about you. Well, if it's not about me, who is it about, actually? And I'm not sure that this model is a really apt one for the what's going on in our certainly our U.S. environment. I don't believe there's going to be some kumbaya moment when we all come together and adapt and adjust to each other. And there's certainly some people whose ideology and hate and negativeness that I do not want to accommodate. And we have to find our barriers or our boundary lines, I guess, not our barriers, but our boundary lines. But sometimes we do need to stop and think about what's going on in our hearts, our souls, our bodies. When we demonize those people, they are already disaffected and disconnected. Maybe there's a third way. We are the bridge people, so let's kind of get with our program and get with our path towards bridging. And realizing that the other aspect of this is this breaking apart, this disjointed world is very natural. The world will always test our convictions every day. If it's a strong one, I realize also that if it's really big and in the world and something like Brexit, it's a sign that, wow, I must have taken a really strong stand. We disrupt and we break down barriers, we break down stereotypes, we break down prejudices in order to break through. We connect people across differences. That is what we do. And all of this together, it transforms the world. Even if it's just a few people at a time or just me, our brains can come to our aid with this, actually. It's an interesting, again, going back to the neurosciences and Matthew Lieberman's book on social, and his book is Social, about why our brains are wired to connect. Do you know that we are pretty much the only species on the planet that actually gets a high, like a chemical high, off of helping people that we don't know or getting involved with strangers? For sure, we're the only species that has the brain power to anticipate what other people might be thinking, and it kind of gives us some, again, a little bit of a high to think that they might approve of what I'm doing or might join in with me. This is called our social reality. Now, that's the next one. I'll stay on this slide. Our social reality is our ability to use our imaginations and to get total strangers to work together. It's like a superpower. Again, if we know how to use it and we can use it for good purposes, in the intercultural field and in diversity and inclusiveness and some of our facilitation work, we're doing this every day and we might not know it. The world does seem like a disjointed place, and our work is to connect across these disjoints. Sometimes we have to disconnect people from their stereotypes and biases. So that disruption to reconnect. If you think about it, and you think about the neuroscience of it, and the fact that we all have different neural paths, 3 trillion different neural paths going on, it is amazing that we can connect it all. And the fact that we are trying to do this across known differences, that is pretty amazing. It's a superpower, and it's something that will certainly create a different world. Imagined reality. I'm also reading this book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind by Yuval Noah Harari. And I was struck by this one thought here about, well, so many thoughts in his book. He's somebody who's disrupting the kind of evolutionary information or knowledge or history that we have of people, but really focused in on what people accomplish together. And unlike lying, an imagined reality is something that everyone believes in. And as long as this communal belief persists, the imagined reality exerts force in the world. It enables millions of strangers to cooperate and work towards common goals. In his book, he talks about kind of the breakdown of the planet, or the fact that human beings have had an outsized impact on the entire planet in our short history of civilization. He talks about the evolution of knowledge and also of agriculture and several other important events in our human history, and how currently we are going down a path that is unsustainable. But I guess if this is possible, that millions of strangers can cooperate and work together towards common goals, perhaps we have an opportunity to change the narrative and to understand that the future is made of encounters. You know, life is flowing through our encounters. Maybe we can change the narrative and have some of those encounters be positive ones, be connected ones, when we choose to connect. So I choose to connect, and this is going back to the social piece of it, is that I have my world that I want to have, which is a connected one, which is where I reach out to people around the world and find a way for us to at least enrich and enhance our own knowledge base, and enrich and enhance and connect with each other and understand the power that we can influence the world with. And over here, you see some of my SIETAR-USA friends, the past and current president of SIETAR-USA. There's Kate Berardo, who many of you know, and Luis Lima, and this is in the Congress in Granada, Spain in 2008. And this is going back to Dublin, and I had a group over dinner, and sometimes the best conversations and the best connectedness happens over meals. This is in Dublin. There we are, Matthew, you and me, and many of our friends, and enjoying the experience of being there. And this is at the Summer Institute that's here in Portland at Reed College, Summer Intercultural Institute, and the ways that we can connect and be together. And here we are, our friends who went out to the wild, wild west of Ireland. It was so interesting to me was that because I had been thinking about this connectedness, I really felt like I could embody it with these people that I met with in Ireland. They were from all over the world. And of course, here's SIETAR-USA. And we can stand and applaud ourselves and create this world of connectedness. This is what I would hope for, and this is the imagination that I'm going to put to this task. And if you can take a moment and kind of breathe and enjoy this reflection of raindrops in the beautiful pond in the Japanese garden in Portland. Be still for a moment and imagine the world that you do want to have. What is it that we would like to create? And I want to welcome you to Sue's world, which is one of connectedness and one of respect and one where we continue our path. As Jack Condon had said at the SIETAR-USA Congress, because in the end we are all part of one tribe, the human tribe. We can change the world if we can tap into this superpower. Thank you very much. This is my presentation, and I'd like to again open it up for any questions or comments, or if you want to type your answers and questions in chat, we'd appreciate it.
Fantastic.
Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much for that. That's really provocative. There's a lot of ideas, and you brought yourself to the show, which is always much appreciated. Vulnerability, as Brene would say. So
yes.
Do type in a few things. There's 3 comments here, one of which is pretty punchy. So I'll just start with a simple statement and then a longer thing, and then Sue, you can react to that. So there's 2 things coming your way. One is not a question. This is a super cool food for thought for our field. This came in a little bit earlier. Matthew, we've never met, but I read your newsletter and feel connected professionally. So again, it's not the audio or the video idea, but that is the printed word or the digital equivalent of the printed word doing something there, but within that idea of tribe. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Then we've got this other one. Here we go. I'll just get the whole thing on my screen so I can read it. It's a split screener. There we are. The theory of constructed emotion helps explain the disconnect that can occur when trying to bridge across difference. For example, around racial experiences, the emotions constructed are different based on what experience we have or don't have of racism. When we don't have the same experience, it can be challenging to connect because we don't necessarily have the same emotions about it. So that's a powerful idea. I don't know if you have a resonant feeling about that, Sue. Can you connect with those statements?
That is a beautiful statement, and it's the question, it's the challenge. Are we up to that? At that point that I made earlier about it's not about you. Well, who is it about if it's not about me? And I understand and appreciate that we can't all have the same experience with prejudice, with racism, depending on where we were brought up. It's this lifelong path, and in that moment, you don't know. And in my case, it may even be just in an intimate family member situation where one sibling and another sibling who were brought up in the same environment, might as well be from Mars and Jupiter, they don't see eye to eye. And I think that it's important to keep trying. That's sometimes the best we can do. And to have that spirit of, well, we need to bridge this. And that there is I guess I'll always continue to imagine the conversation that comes together and assume that that's possible. And maybe I'll be disappointed once again, but if I try to assume and create my own imagination, for how that would be possible to bridge, that goes at least a ways. And also being aware that, I can only do what's going on in my head and constructing my own emotions. I can kind of anticipate what somebody else might feel or think, but and we're the only creatures that can begin to have that idea of, I can sort of imagine what, Matthew, what you might respond in a certain situation. But beyond that, the only thing I can be responsible for is myself and my own reactions, my own responses in the world. So it's okay. That maybe that story with me and the person I cannot connect with, and trying to create empathy and trying to create something different, a different conversation in the future. Keep trying.
Keep trying. We tried something fairly provocative yesterday. There was a lot of difference in the room, and there was a lot of pain as well. And some guys really won't react too well to this, but there's a logic for the individual. Even the most hating, and we know that really is the most fearful person, has an internal logic that works for them. If we were more honest, would say I despise them and their views. They have an internal logic for them, and maybe that's the contact point. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of stuff there. Let's move on. There's a couple of things here. A comment from the Netherlands. What makes us feel disconnected? And this person's heard that some people in the US nowadays feel they have zero friends. They have no friends. They have just virtual connections on Facebook. So just absorb that comment for a second. And then we've got something again from the Green Emerald Isle. Can you talk, please, about levels of connectedness, the connection you have to someone you have shared a deep emotional or traumatic life experience with is higher than a connectedness with one of your Facebook friends? How do you feel to that?
Two interesting and not unrelated comments.
Yeah.
Do we have the same level of connectedness in the Facebook arena, social media? Can we really meaningfully share experiences there as compared to sharing a traumatic event? I like that notion. For me, and I think that, again, I may have to write the book of my interpretation of what relationships are about, but shared experience, for me, is one of the definitions of a connected relationship. And I am not sure how easy it is to share an emotional experience with someone who is in a virtual sense. Although I know people who have created relationships through channels like Second Life was a very good example of this. Yeah. Whole friendships, relationships, getting married, getting divorced. I mean, the whole family that you created in a very virtual space. I think what's fascinating about this is because it's our imagination at work, your imagination may not know the difference between somebody who you're sitting next to in person and somebody who you're imagining in a virtual space. So there could be a feeling of deep connectedness that can happen in the virtual space. I will always advocate face-to-face because I think there's that sensory piece of it it's certainly important for me. It's like to see the person, to know how they sit and feel their breath in a sense, or to be able to touch them if I need to. There's all of the use of all of the senses, which so far in the virtual space we haven't quite been able to recreate. That's my bias. You have something you want to add to that conversation, Matthew?
No. I mean, that's about. Just when you said that, I thought about there's the most moving of novels. So we are. I always quote Ulysses. I'm one of the very few people who finished it and liked it. And you just think it was. You could smell the urine in that and some of the pages. If you read that, you'll know what I'm talking about. Have this thing. It doesn't have to be real for us to have a sense. Do you ever think you go back to a memory of a place and the smell comes back to you? If I say pine forest or something, there's more to it, but very good. That's sort of. Here's another one from Germany. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your stories on connectivity. Our brain's plasticity, difficult word for me to say, shows that we have no excuse not to connect. So this is a question for you, Sue. When did you realize that you actually want to reconnect with the surroundings after your relocation back to the US?
Oh, there's an important question. I think I believe it was that moment that my husband said, get out of the house in a sense. I mean, he didn't really like physically kick me out the door and lock it, but the fact that I needed such a drastic push. If you know my husband, he's a very laid back guy. He does not, we rarely have these knockdown, drag out fights. So that moment of, wow, wake up call, I need to do something else. I need to reevaluate how I'm responding in this situation. And I think that it may have helped. No, definitely it helped that the Summer Institute, which at that time was out at Pacific University, allowed me to be in a community of people who had had the same kind of experiences that I had had. And moving into a new neighborhood, the neighborhood that I moved into, where my home is now, it's amazing. Everybody who's moved, every other person, or pretty much 75% of the households here, it's people who have come from another part of the world.
Yep.
Around my one little cul-de-sac, we've got people from India, China, Mexico, Cambodia, Germany, and Ukraine. Let's see what I can't even name all of the different countries. So it's interesting that the UN kind of moved into my neighborhood, and that really helped. It's like I had this idea that suburban Portland, I'm going to be doomed, and then here I have the world with me. So I made it a kind of my point to connect with my neighbors and to get to know them on a different basis and to let them know that, I'm glad you're here. And they're hardworking people. This is thanks to Intel and Nike and all the companies that are around here. But, I'm very glad they're here and improving the environment for me personally.
Lovely, lovely, lovely.
So I guess that was my moment, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Here's another one. You brought us a lot of new ideas and questions to think and rethink. It sounds so easy, but feels so hard when we are being challenged in the moment, especially when the person we are connecting with is not feeling or thinking the same thing as we are. Just like the example of racism that was given by one of us a minute ago. Can you tell us what keeping keeping to try to connect brought you? So you were persistent in your efforts. Well, like what you just said, to keep on connecting has brought you. So what's the benefit of perseverance when you are attempting to connect with anybody or being persistent when it's not going so well?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And there are times when the best persistence is to remember that the most important point of connection is with myself. Kind of to tap into what am I feeling about this, to get myself quiet, to experience some stillness, and to think about why is it so important. Just exactly your question of why is it so important that I move this person to my point of view. Is that what I'm actually up to? Am I actually being empathic and listening to them and trying to educate the thing that works for them? And am I willing to go to that point, especially around, when I see it as being prejudice or hate or a lack of cultural empathy or lack of cultural sensitivity? And there may be some people out there that we cannot necessarily break through with, but they are our teachers. And in that moment, you're absolutely right. It sounds really easy, but it is so hard. So keeping that in mind and trying to breathe. There's that 4-second, what is it, the 5-second rule, or there's a book about, your brain takes 5 seconds to react to something emotional, or actually your brain wants to react from its reptilian side of flight or fight or what have you. Yeah. If you stop and you breathe before you respond, you can actually change the dialogue to something that you really want and to have an outcome that you really desire. So you have to imagine what the outcome is that you would like to have before you open your mouth and push that person further into a corner. I don't know. There's no way, but I don't.
No, very good. So, yeah, Viktor Frankl or Stephen Covey, we can choose our response. Count to 10, good conflict resolution ideas. I like it. Imagine, edit, then speak. That sounds good. Here's an amazing one from a very powerful person. I think a photo we share and comment on is very powerful. So this is the use of social media and images. You've used a lot of those too. My 94-year-old mom met her 4-month-old granddaughter from a different continent a few days before she passed away. That photo speaks volumes, and my social network could feel it and see it. So thanks to you, Sue, for helping us to think about emotion and connection. It comforts part of our teaching approach. That's a lovely idea.
Right. Okay, so I guess we have come to the end of our hour, and I always like to part with remembering that the world, the journey that we're on, the journey of discovery isn't necessarily in going to a new land, but in seeing the one that we're already in with a new set of eyes, and maybe in this case, a new brain or a new way to look at our brain, and that will propel us into the future, into this new world that we want to create. Thank you very much for participating today. And if you would like to connect with me, I will be very happy to continue the discussion in this community and beyond. And I will be making a network and creating a newsletter around this notion of connectedness. That's my commitment to myself and to my intercultural community. And I'll look forward to continuing the discussion with all of you there. Thank you so much.
Well, yes, exactly. So two things. Thank you, everybody, for connecting at a social, anti-social time of day. Thank you for the quality and the volume of participation. That's always heartening across the ether with eclipses and the rest of it. And Sue, thank you for your richness, your life experience, and your vulnerability, and generously sharing your stories with us. That shocking start, I was chucked out of the house. That was resolved, but it's all good. And if you want to keep in touch with Sue, Sue is an extraordinary networker and is building a community, is building through a newsletter and other things. So we'll send you out some connections. So do follow and keep the dialogue going. That's going to be very powerful. And I know that Sue and myself, for that matter, are open to that. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks again to Sue for an extraordinary, very rich, very reflective session. It wasn't a data dump. That was an emotionally resonant piece, which I think will stay with us for some time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll see you on the Intercultural Training channel next time. But for now, Sue, if you want to say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you very much. Remember that ripple effect.
Exactly. The hits just keep on coming. No, very good. Thank you very much. We will see you next time. But that's brilliant. All right. Goodbye for now. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.